Not everyone dies from a knife wound. Some are buried alive in silence little by the very people they call family. Harper Linwood had always been the steady pillar her entire family leaned on, not out of love, but because they knew she wouldn't say no. She was the backup plan, the final signature, the safe exit when everything fell apart. But on an otherwise ordinary morning in Boston, a phone call from the bank changed everything. Not a sudden disaster, but a painful awakening that sometimes betrayal doesn't come with daggers or screaming. All it takes is a forged signature, a trust misused, and a family too accustomed to exploiting kindness. This isn't just a story about debt and legal battles. It is the journey of a woman who stepped out of the role of the fixer, quietly gathering the stolen pieces of her life and reclaiming her own name. That Wednesday, the Boston sky hung gray as if mirroring the very state of Harper Linwood's soul. She had just poured her second cup of coffee, hadn't even caught her breath after the morning rush, when her phone screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. No name, no clear reason to answer, but she picked up as if it had been predetermined. "Hello, am I speaking with Ms. Harper Linwood?" A low, polite, emotionless male voice. "This is Charles from Monarch Federal Bank. We're calling about your mortgage account, which currently has a remaining balance of $523,000. Harper stopped breathing. "I don't have a mortgage," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "You must have the wrong person." A pause. Then Charles spoke slowly as if reading from a screen. "The file matches your full name, date of birth, and social security number. You are listed as the primary borrower. The loan was opened 3 years ago. 3 years." Harper's heart froze. 3 years ago was when her younger sister Juniper first started talking about buying a house. She used to show off Pinterest boards of dream homes, talking about wide porches and rooms for future kids. Back then, Juniper was unemployed, drowning in debt, but their mother had reassured her, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Family always finds a way." But this wasn't that way. Harper ended the call politely, almost mechanically, then sat still, her gaze vacant as if the entire world had just been erased. Her palms were soaked with sweat, her mouth as dry as if she had walked through a desert. She told herself it must be a mistake, someone with the same name, maybe a clerical error. But her gut screamed otherwise. She tore through her bedside drawer, pulling out old receipts, forgotten letters, and then a flyer from Monarch Federal itself, one she'd once dismissed and tossed aside. Now it felt like a warning flag she had ignored. Sitting amid a storm of scattered papers, Harper suddenly came to a painful realization: she owned no property, held no loans, had kept her finances neat and minimal, specifically to avoid things like this. Yet someone had used her name to drag her into a debt of over $500,000, and it wasn't a stranger. Only family would have had access to the right information: her social security number, her signature passport copies, all from the times she had helped them fill out student loan applications, insurance forms, hospital paperwork. She once thought it was kindness. But then, like a blade sliding in with precision, a thought formed clearly in her mind. Some betrayals don't knock loudly, they just quietly turn the lock behind your back. Harper didn't sleep that night. She lay flat on her bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if searching for a crack to cling to. In the silence of her small apartment, the same questions repeated like waves crashing against a cliff. If they had asked, would she have agreed to help? Probably not. But what haunted her wasn't what they had done. It was that they never asked. Her choice had been stolen from the start, as if her trust was a resource they were entitled to use freely. By morning, before the first sunlight spilled through the window, Harper had stopped fooling herself into thinking this was some kind of mistake. The puzzle pieces were falling into place in a terrifyingly precise way: the timeline, the method, the strange silence from her mother and Juniper over the past few years. Harper remembered clearly the last time Juniper talked about her dream house: a home with a basement, a wide porch for hosting parties, and enough space for a future family. At the time, Juniper had no job and her credit score was nearly unsalvageable. Yet their mother had simply smiled and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart, Maddie will figure it out." Maddie, the nickname they used for Harper at home, turns out, was the way. Harper began pulling out old documents from the cabinet tax returns, copies of her Social Security card, the insurance forms she had co-signed, when her mother had surgery student loan paperwork she had filled out for Juniper. Page by page, it was like peeling back her own skin in front of a giant mirror. All of them bore her signature, real, given away in silence, with a blind belief that love was unconditional. She remembered all the times she'd been called the strong daughter, the one who doesn't need looking after, the one who always figures it out. Those compliments now felt like ropes tightening around her trust, because it turned out they never saw her as someone who needed protecting. They saw her as the wall to lean on, the contingency plan, the pawn in their own blueprint. As a child, Juniper once broke their mother's prized crystal vase, and their mother had merely sighed. "She's growing up, don't blame her." But when Harper forgot to bring home her report card, her mother stayed angry for nearly a week. When Juniper skipped school, their father called it a rebellious phase. But when Harper asked for an old laptop to study, he responded, "We don't print money here." Harper used to think their strictness was how they taught her to be responsible. Now she realized they never actually believed she could fall. And maybe that's why they didn't think using her name, her reputation, and her future to cover Juniper's failures was wrong. Because in their eyes, Harper Linwood was strong enough not to break. But they were wrong. Very wrong. Everything began to change, not with anger, but with an eerie stillness. Not with shouting nor with tears, but with the feeling that a door inside had quietly yet decisively closed. Harper opened her laptop, hands still trembling, and submitted a request to Monarch Federal to obtain the complete loan file. The woman on the other end of the line, professional and emotionless, sent her a massive PDF copies of the mortgage contract notarization confirmations. And, of course, the signature. Harper stared at it for a long time, as if confronting a distorted reflection of herself. Her name, her birth date. Every detail matched except the signature. Not completely wrong, but wrong in a terrifying way, too similar, yet not hers. It lacked the familiar hesitation on the initial R, the subtle slant in the final Y of her last name, Delaney, that Harper always unconsciously made. This signature was bold, deliberate, written by someone who had never known fear. Harper felt a chill crawl down her spine. It was a forgery crafted by someone who knew her too well, someone who had practiced, studied, and replicated until it was perfect. And the most horrifying part was that she knew exactly who that person was. No need to call. No need to text. No need to confront. Harper simply began printing every document, confirmation emails, time-stamped logs, loan statements. She dug out all the instances she'd ever signed something on someone else's behalf: hospital forms for her mother's student loan applications, for Juniper insurance paperwork, tax documents. Each one was a piece of her identity handed over silently without condition. No one had ever asked for Harper's consent. They had simply assumed she would always say sure, as if by reflex. But now that reflex had become evidence, each fragment part of a picture she never agreed to draw. Her small kitchen transformed into a command center. Stacks of documents carefully categorized, each section marked with highlighters, each copy laminated, every email backed up to a USB. Not for revenge, but for survival. Harper no longer saw herself as the good daughter, the responsible sister, or the family's dependable fallback. She was a victim of a scheme disguised by familiarity. By the phrase "just lending a hand," by the belief that family ties could override legal boundaries. Then one day, while labeling files, Harper heard a whisper from a colleague at work, her friend Sloane. "You look like you've been holding your breath all week," she said. Harper gave a faint smile. No explanation, no monologue. But perhaps because of that, for the first time, she let everything spill out. not to seek sympathy, but because she needed a witness, someone who could see her not as the strong one, but as a human being on the verge of breaking. And then, with a simple nod, Sloane handed Harper a small piece of paper. Call this guy. He's good and he doesn't shy away from family drama. Harper folded the slip, tucked it into her wallet as if she were safeguarding a key. A way out. A final chance. His name was Whitaker Beale, a lawyer, a former military officer with a gaze sharp enough to suggest he had seen the worst of what humans could do to one another. His office wasn't anything glamorous, just an old wooden desk tucked into a quiet cafe 3 blocks from Harper's apartment. No signage, no receptionist, just him, and a black coffee with no sugar. When Harper handed him the thick stack of documents she had painstakingly compiled over countless sleepless nights, he didn't ask any questions. He simply turned page after page with steady hands, his eyes locked on every word, every punctuation mark, as if decoding a wartime cipher. When he finally looked up, it wasn't with pity, nor with outrage, just confirmation. "You know what you're facing, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and unhurried. Harper nodded. "I think I do. It's not just forgery," he said. "It's identity theft. And if prosecuted, it's a criminal offense." At that, Harper's chest tightened. Words like legal police and prosecution suddenly felt terrifyingly real, but she didn't back down. She simply asked, "So what can I do?" Beale didn't waste time with preambles. He laid out each step as if strategizing for battle file: a police report, send an official complaint to the bank, submit legal evidence, and if necessary, pursue litigation. Every action was a clean cut, a severing from everything Harper had once called home, blood trust. "It won't be easy," he said plainly. "And you need to accept this. Once you start, there's no turning back." Harper didn't respond right away. She simply stared down at the cup of coffee in front of her, where the surface reflected a face that was both familiar and foreign, her own, but sharper, steadier, as if through each layer of pain, she had finally begun to see herself clearly. When she left the cafe, the early October wind cut through her coat, but Harper didn't feel cold. She walked slowly through the narrow streets, every word from Beale echoing in her mind, every warning, every consequence. But none of it made her falter. In her bag, the stack of documents had been carefully reorganized like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Harper knew she wasn't seeking revenge. What she wanted was justice. Not dramatic, not sensational. Just the truth acknowledged, recorded, and corrected. They had used her name as a tool, a backup plan, an easy way out of failure. But she was ready to prove no one gets to carry her name without paying the price. Sunday arrived faster than Harper expected. She stood in front of her parents' old house in the suburbs of Manchester, the house with white painted shutters and a cracked driveway that hadn't been repaired in nearly a decade. In her handbag was a thick folder, its corners slightly worn from being flipped through too many times over the past week. She hadn't told anyone in the family she was coming, hadn't sent a warning. Everything would be said or not at dinner. The door opened almost the moment her hand rose to knock. Her mother, Lorna, appeared with a bright smile as if the $500,000 matter had never happened. "Harper, sweetheart," she said, "I just finished the roast." The scent of onions and tangy sweet sauce hit Harper like a slap of memory. Nothing had changed inside the house: the same worn cream-colored walls, the scuffed brown sofa, the familiar dim yellow light from the ceiling fixture. Juniper sat curled up on the couch with her phone in hand, a drained wine glass beside her. Her father, Martin, was in front of the TV, engrossed in a football game, as if the outside world didn't exist. Harper sat at the dinner table. No one mentioned the real reason she was there. Her mother talked about a new vegetable dish she had tried in the pressure cooker. Juniper complained about the homeowners association. Her father nodded along to every sentence, occasionally grunting when his team nearly scored. Harper stayed silent. She chewed each bite of mashed potatoes mechanically, counting breaths in her head. When the meal ended, plates cleared, wine refilled, she finally spoke, calm, steady, without a trace of anger or sarcasm. "Do you know anything about a mortgage taken out in my name?" The question landed in the room like a crystal glass shattering on a wooden floor, loud splintering, yet no one dared to react. Juniper froze. Her hand holding the glass halted midair. Her mother's smile, stiffened eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Her father picked up the remote, then put it back down as if searching for an exit with no escape route. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice as soft as if apologizing for oversalting the meal. "Oh, sweetheart, it's just paperwork. Juniper needed a bit of help to qualify. It's not like you have to pay for it. We're family." Juniper didn't look at Harper. She simply said, like reciting an old status update, "You have good credit. I don't. Can't we help each other just once?" Harper looked at each of them, not with hatred, but with a chilling emptiness. They didn't think they were wrong. They thought she was selfish for asking. They saw her as the troublemaker, not the victim. And in that moment, Harper understood this was no longer a family. These were people who had grown used to seeing her as the last resort whenever they messed things up. But this time, she hadn't come to fix anything. She came to end it. Harper left the house with a face no one could read. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't hurt, just silence. She had sat through the entire dinner listening to them talk about the weather, the food, the garden flowers, as if nothing had happened. She didn't confront, didn't expose. She asked a single simple question, and with the answer, everything became clearer than ever. They didn't think they were wrong. They just thought she should keep quiet. And because of that, they had lost the privilege of knowing what would come next. The next morning, Harper put on a high-collared blouse, tied her hair neatly, and went to the city police station. The officer who received her file was a middle-aged man with bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep, his voice gentle as if accustomed to broken family stories. When Harper handed him the thick, meticulously organized file with annotated notes, he didn't ask why she was doing this. He slowly turned each page, his expression growing more serious. "Are you sure?" he asked, not out of doubt, but as a warning. Harper nodded. "If I don't do this, they'll just do something else." The officer said nothing more, just stamped the final page. The sound of the stamp pressing into paper echoed like a clean blade slicing through invisible ties. Harper felt as if she had just signed her own birth certificate, a version of herself that no longer belonged to anyone, no longer bore the weight of others' mistakes. That afternoon, she went to the Central Post Office. In her hand was a carefully sealed envelope, the police report, the formal complaint to Monarch, federal copies of her identification. She watched the clerk drop it into the outgoing mail tray. It looked no different from hundreds of letters sent daily, but to Harper it was a declaration of independence. No final messages, no angry texts, no late-night phone calls. Just absolute silence, the very thing she once feared, now her quiet pride. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week. No one called. No one checked in. There was no outrage, no apology. Only an ever-widening gap between her and the people who shared her blood. Then on Friday evening, as Harper sat on her sofa reviewing her credit report, a knock sounded at the door, not frantic but weighted. Through the peephole, she saw her mother Lorna standing outside in her best coat, her face stiff with a feeling somewhere between fear and fury. Harper opened the door but did not invite her in. Her mother stepped across the threshold without waiting for permission, and almost immediately the blade-sharp words were released. How dare you go to the police?" Her voice trembled not with emotion, but with a loss of control. Harper didn't reply. She looked at her mother as if seeing a stranger, not because she had changed, but because the familiarity now revealed its true face. "You've always been the reasonable one," her mother continued. "Juniper needed help. Family is supposed to stick together." Harper exhaled quietly. Family is supposed to ask, not steal. The words weren't loud, but they silenced Lorna instantly. "You've destroyed everything," she whispered. Harper gently shook her head. No, I just stopped pretending it hadn't already been destroyed long ago. Then she closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking into place was soft, but to Harper it was the loudest sound she had ever made in her life. The first message from Juniper arrived at 2 a.m. the next morning. Then came a call. Then 11 more, each longer, more frantic, her voice increasingly unraveling. Harper didn't answer any of them. She didn't listen to a single one of the 4 voicemails left behind. She simply watched the screen light up and fade like a flickering flame in the dark, clinging to its last ember. It wasn't because she hated them. It was because she no longer expected anything from those people. On Monday morning, an email from Monarch Federal appeared in Harper's inbox. The subject line was brief. Mortgage status. Urgent update. She opened it, no racing heart, no shallow breath, just calm as if she'd already known. Inside was an official apology from the bank. They had received the investigative documents, temporarily suspended the mortgage contract, and launched an internal review. The signature file was being verified with the notary office, and most importantly, the entire loan was under review for legal legitimacy. Harper sat still for a long time after reading. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She only felt a quiet release radiate from her chest, as if she'd finally pushed a massive stone off a road long obstructed. She called Whitaker Beale right afterward. "They're taking it seriously," she said. He replied simply, "Truth is usually convincing if you let it speak for itself." Harper knew he was right. Throughout this entire ordeal, she had never raised her voice. No angry texts, no dramatic confrontations. She had simply stayed quiet, prepared, and presented the evidence. And as it turned out, sometimes that's what makes people retreat. Not because you shout louder, but because they have no way left to deny. The days that followed passed in a strange kind of peace. No more messages from Juniper. No voicemails from her mother. No subtle reminders that she should be grateful to have a family. Nothing at all, just emptiness. But for Harper, that emptiness was liberation. She began filling her weekends with things she had long pushed aside, walking through the farmer's market, buying a few simple flowers for the dining table, taking pottery classes on Saturdays at the community center. Not to stay busy and forget, but to remind herself that she was still her own person, a human being with interests, a rhythm of life, and a space that didn't belong to anyone else. She didn't dwell on revenge. She didn't need anyone to fall for her to rise. She only wanted space to breathe, and now finally she had it. On a breezy afternoon, while arranging small ceramic pieces for her booth at the local craft fair, she placed a slightly misshapen terracotta mug with a label that read, "Reclamation." A woman stopped, picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and asked, "What does the name mean?" Harper simply smiled, because it wasn't supposed to exist, but it does. The woman nodded, paid, and walked away. And in that moment, Harper understood more clearly than ever she didn't need anyone to validate her truth. She only needed to stand still, live honestly, and let her very existence be the clearest proof that no one can take her voice away forever. Harper hadn't kept track of how many weeks had passed since she filed the police report and sent off the official dispute letter. All she knew was that spring had arrived quietly, without fanfare, the way real change often does. She still woke up early, still worked, still brewed her morning tea by hand, but something inside her had shifted. Gone was the tension every time her phone lit up. Gone were the nights she jolted awake from dreams of forged documents bearing a signature that wasn't hers. In its place was a deep stillness, not of resignation, but of someone who had walked through the storm and come out standing. She spent more time on the little things, neatly folding clothes in her closet, placing fresh flowers in a sea blue ceramic vase, listening to classical music in the late afternoon. She didn't rush anymore, nor did she feel like she had to prove anything to anyone. When checking her credit report, she saw the score hadn't fully recovered. The fallout from the fraudulent mortgage still lingered. But instead of feeling angry or defeated, she simply noted each item to follow up, each agency to update. That calm didn't come from having everything resolved, it came from knowing she was in control of the process. One Saturday morning, while tidying her ceramics booth at the weekend fair, Harper received an email from Attorney Beale. The subject line read only 2 words: Progress Update. Inside was a draft confirmation letter from the bank, stating that the loan file had been reclassified as suspected fraud, along with a formal commitment to remove the credit impact once the investigation concluded. Harper sat on the steps, phone in hand, reading the lines as golden sunlight spilled over her. She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She simply closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if she could finally breathe with lungs that were entirely her own. While she sat there, she watched people pass by, children tugging their parents toward cotton candy, elderly couples pausing at the handmade stalls, laughter mingling with the soft calls of vendors. Harper realized the world had kept turning even when she was pushed into an invisible abyss. And now she was turning with it, not as the dutiful older sister, not as the stopgap solution to someone else's mistakes, but as herself, untethered, unburdened. That evening, she sat alone on her balcony, cradling the slightly misshapen ceramic mug she had named Reclamation, her fingers tracing the rough ridge along its rim. The sky had deepened to violet, and the city lights blinked softly in the distance. She didn't need anyone to tell her she'd done the right thing. She knew it. And for Harper, for the first time in years, that was enough. That evening, as Harper folded the tablecloths at her ceramic stall, the sunset poured golden light across the cracked pavement in front of the market porch. She froze at the familiar feeling of being watched. She turned around. At the far end of the parking lot, just a few dozen steps away, stood 3 figures: her mother, her father, and Juniper. They didn't stand close like 3 broken lines of a triangle that no longer had corners. They didn't approach. They didn't leave. They simply stood there as if hoping she'd be the one to shorten the distance first. Harper placed her bag on the ground and walked toward them slowly. She wasn't defensive, wasn't in a rush, wasn't hopeful. When they saw her, all 3 froze, her mother clutching her purse strap as if it were the last thing holding her together, her father in a wrinkled shirt not making eye contact, and Juniper, pale, mascara smudged, looking as though she'd cried, but didn't want anyone to know. Her mother was the first to speak, voice tight with emotion. "Harper, we were wrong, but we're still family." Juniper stepped forward halfway, her lips trembling. "I just needed help. For a while. Please don't cut us off." Harper looked at them, not as people who once held dominion over her emotions, not as the center of her life anymore. Now they were simply people who had made the wrong choices, who had hurt her, and who now stood there because they needed something from her. Again. "I don't need an apology," Harper said quietly, "and I don't need another excuse." Her voice wasn't cold or sharp, just still, like water after a long storm. She opened her coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope clearly prepared long ago. She handed it to her mother. Inside is a copy of the fraudulent mortgage agreement stamped void, and on the back is the birthday card from when I turned 28. The one where you wrote, "We're so lucky to have you, our family's best backup plan." Her mother's hands trembled as she took the envelope. None of them spoke. "I'm not angry," Harper continued, her tone steady and unshaken. "Not anymore. But I'm free, and I'm not coming back." Then she turned and walked away. The sound of her heels striking the ground rang louder than any accusation. At the top of the stairs, she didn't look back, but she paused for a moment. The wind caught the hem of her coat, and the golden light cast her shadow long across the pavement. And Harper, not speaking to anyone else, whispered only to herself, "Sometimes leaving is the loudest thing you can do." They had used her name as if it belonged to them, but now she carried it whole and undeniable away from all of them, without fanfare, without warning. only with a silence they could no longer ignore. If you've ever been treated as someone else's contingency plan, perhaps you understand why Harper didn't look back. And why, for the first time in a very long time, she was truly herself. Harper didn't choose revenge, she chose truth. No grand speeches, no one forced to bow their head. She simply walked away from the ties that once suffocated her, and finally lived a life that belonged only to her, not carrying anyone else's name, not being anyone else's projection. Sometimes silence is the loudest voice. Sometimes standing up isn't about fighting, it's about walking away. If you've ever been seen as the one who's always okay, plan B, or the person who never needs to be asked, maybe you'll understand why Harper didn't look back. Because not every forgiveness requires an apology. And not every relationship labeled family is worth holding on to. If this story has touched you in any way, hit subscribe so you don't miss the raw, intense, and deeply honest reflections on relationships where sometimes it's the closeness itself that hurts the most. Because the truth deserves to be told. And sometimes a single story at the right moment is enough to help you step out of your own silence.